Hello, everyone. Wanted to go ahead and start the live stream a few minutes early to give people some time to join us. So if you are watching, let us know where you're watching from. And I'm Kristen, known as Baker Betty online, and I am watching from Chicago. So really excited to be doing this with you all. And we won't get officially started till a few minutes after 1 o'clock Central Time so that everyone has time to join us. But really excited to see you all here. Hi, Matt. Hi, Amy. Memphis, Tennessee. Awesome. Watching from the Philippines. Oh my goodness. I can't believe you stayed up so late for this. You are so sweet. If you do want to go to bed, this live stream will live on the Baker Betty Facebook page and the Baker Betty YouTube channel. So if you don't want to watch live, you can come back to watch it. That's so sweet of you to stay up so late. Jacksonville, Florida. Hello. Thanks so much for being here. California. Awesome. All over the place. So we'll give everybody a little time to jump in. If you didn't see, I pinned a comment to the top of the thread. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're watching on Facebook, I can't pin comments. So you'll have to just click on the top comment. And there is a document that's kind of notes from today's session. So if you want to use that for your own reference, if you want to follow along today, I do have a slideshow that I'm going to be presenting on the screen. So you may just want to watch the screen during the presentation, but then you can have that document for your future reference. When you click on that, you are only able to view it. It's in a view only format. So if you want to make any of your own notes on it, you're going to want to go up to File and Make a Copy. And then that will put it in your Google Drive for your own copy to make your own notes on. So that is pinned to the top of the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. If you're on Facebook, I can't pin comments, but it should be the top comment. Hello, everybody on TikTok. If you want to see the full presentation, there is a link in my bio for the YouTube presentation. Otherwise, you're welcome to just watch here and listen. I'm going to be doing a Fundamentals of Baking Science presentation. I'm not baking today. We're going to just talk about baking science. There will be a few little video clips if you watch the full presentation on YouTube, but it's mostly a discussion today, and I'm going to be answering a lot of questions, talking about ingredient functions and everything like that. So awesome. Lots watching. How quickly I forgot your words. I scored my sandwich loaf and I tore my crust apart. Oh no. That's okay. I'm sure it was still delicious. Hi from Florida. Hi from Toronto, Huntsville. Awesome. Everybody everywhere. So yes, Rachel, this is going to be recorded. It will live forever on the YouTube channel, the Baker Betty YouTube channel, and on the Baker Betty Facebook page. If you are in my Baker Betty private community group, it will also be there. So it will be, wherever you are to find it. So if you can't watch live with us, you can always come back and watch it. I'm not sure how long today's session will go. I don't want to keep you all too long. I'm guessing it probably will go about 2 hours because there's a lot to cover, and I really want to make sure I get all of the baking science information covered that I can for you and answer as many questions as I can. Again, if you're just tuning in on TikTok, I am doing a free baking fundamentals live stream. If you would like to see the full presentation, because I do have a slideshow that I'm going to be sharing, you might want to go to the link in my TikTok bio and click on the top link, and that will take you to the YouTube live stream, and you'll be able to see the full presentation. So, all right, what time is it? Let's give everybody just another minute or two. It's just now 1 o'clock, so I want to make sure everybody has a chance to pop in. If you haven't yet already, let me know where you're watching from. Please let me know. Hi, Billy. Thanks so much for stopping in. Totally get it if you can't stay. You're so sweet. Thank you for the roses. Love you too. Oh my goodness, Athens, Greece. What time is it in Athens? I bet It's probably late there, I'm guessing, although I don't know. Hi from London. Goodness, you guys are watching from all over. I love it. Amsterdam. Amazing. Georgia. Cool. Awesome. Okay, let me pull up my presentation here. All right, is everybody able to see that if you're watching on YouTube or Facebook? Can you just confirm you're able to hear me well and you can see the presentation? There might be a little bit of a lag here. Central Illinois, awesome. I'm in Chicago, so practically neighbors. Hello, so nice to see you. All right, perfect, everyone. So, okay, I am going to be covering a lot of information today. So I will try to answer as many questions as I can. If I don't get to your question, hopefully, you can email me at bakerbetty@gmail.com if you really have a burning question that I'm not able to get to today. But I will try to get to as many as I possibly can. Try to answer the most common ones I see coming in. And because we are covering so many topics today, try to keep the topics or the questions that you're asking on topic for what we're talking about in that moment. Because I may cover what you're going to ask later in the conversation if we're not on that topic yet. And then at the end, I'll try to just answer some miscellaneous questions that we didn't get to during the presentation. Again, if you are just popping into the live stream, this is our free virtual Fundamentals of Baking Science class. This is going to be recorded and will live on my YouTube page and the Baker Betty Facebook page. If you're watching on TikTok, there is a link in my bio if you want to go to the YouTube link to see the full presentation, because I do have a full presentation that I am showing. So happy to have you all here, and thank you so much for joining me. Just a little quick overview of what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about baking fundamentals. I really want to give you a good groundwork and a good basic understanding of baking science and how ingredient functions, how they work together, and some proper techniques. So I'm hoping that you'll walk out of today with a lot of confidence with how baking kind of works at its most fundamental level, because I really think that is the most helpful thing in the kitchen. If you have any baking flops, or if you're kind of confused about a technique, just having that really good fundamental knowledge. So that is the goal for today. So a couple of the topics that we're going to discuss today are, like I said, ingredient functions. That is really the main section we're covering today, because ingredient functions is such a big part of how baking works, understanding how they function on their own and how they interact with each other, because then you can assess what may have gone wrong. If you need to make a substitution, you can more critically think about that. And I think it's just such an important part of the baking process. We're also going to briefly talk about ingredient substitutions. Now, truthfully, that topic could be an entire presentation on its own. So we're not going to get extremely in-depth in ingredient substitutions, but we are going to cover it briefly and give some good general rules of thumb. I also want to address ingredient temperatures and some foundational techniques. And then at the end, we're going to do some baking flop examples and kind of do some troubleshooting so that you can understand what may have happened with some most common baking flops. All right, so just quickly before we get started, just a bit about me. If you aren't familiar with me, hi, I'm Baker Betty. My real name is Kristen Hoffman. I go by Baker Betty online. Betty is kind of my online baking alter ego. I answer to either name. You can call me either. A little bit about my background. I am originally a self-taught baker. So I moved out of the house when I was 18-year-old and truly had not baked a single thing in my entire life, like not even from a box mix. And I think that I just wanted to kind of feel like an adult and be able to make food for myself. So I started teaching myself how to bake. And originally it was kind of just like chocolate chip cookies off the back of the bag. But I got a little more adventurous, got really interested in baking science. And for about 5 years, teaching myself and reading every resource I could. So I started bakerbetty.com in 2011, and that was really a place for me to just document recipes, document different things that I was learning. And then I decided to go to culinary school in 2013 and kind of commit myself to food as a career. And I worked in restaurants for a while, worked as a private chef for a while, and now I teach online full time as Baker Betty. So I teach on my website, I teach on YouTube, and I have workshops in the Chicago area when we're not in the middle of a pandemic. And I have an online baking school that you can take courses through. And then I also just wrote a baking fundamentals book that's going to actually be released in November. The release date got pushed back a little bit, but November of 2021. So super excited about that. I'm seeing somebody saying they're not able to watch. Not sure what's going on there. I think a lot of you are able to see. So hopefully they're able to find it another way. I'm not sure what's going on. Okay, cool. So that's just a little bit of background about me. And now I want to dive into ingredient functions. So the first ingredient we're going to talk about is flour, because wheat flour in traditional baking is arguably the most important ingredient. It is the structure of most baked goods, and understanding how it functions is really essential for better baking and really essential for assessing baking flops, because a lot of times things that go wrong in baking have to do with either the way you measured flour or the way you mixed flour. All of those things can cause a lot of issues with your baking. Okay, hold on just a second. I just want to make sure. Is everybody able to see me here? People on Facebook are maybe saying it's paused. Is everybody else able to see me? Can you confirm? I'm not sure what's going on. It looks like YouTube is going and Facebook is going, hopefully. Okay. Hopefully some people are seeing. Okay. All right. I'm not sure what some people are having issues. I'm going to write in the chat really quick. If you're having issues to go out and come back in. I'm not sure why some people are having issues. Okay. Perfect. Moving on to continuing to talk about flour. So in order to talk about flour, we have to talk about gluten, because that really is the main function of flour, is to build a gluten structure through the production of gluten. So to build structure in our baked goods through the production of gluten. So there are a few different kinds of wheat flour that are used in baking, and we're going to get into those a little more depth as we go through, but they all essentially serve the same function. They are building structure in our baked goods through that production of gluten. So wheat flour contains two proteins. It contains gluten and gliadin. And those two proteins bond together to form this really elastic network called gluten. And they start bonding together as soon as they are moisturized. So as soon as you add any liquid into your baked good that contains flour, those proteins start bonding together to form this gluten structure. So when a dough or batter is baked, this elastic gluten network really stretches to contain the gases in the baked goods, and this is what allows them to rise. So a really strong gluten network is going to produce a baked good with a lot of chew. So think about bread. Bread is something where we really want a strong gluten network, because that is going to build all of that chewy texture for us. But a weak gluten network is going to produce a baked good that's really light and tender. So think about a cake. For a cake, we're trying to limit the amount of gluten. We do need some in order for our cake to rise and hold those gases in, but we don't want it to go too far because we don't want a chewy cake. That's not very appetizing. So gluten is formed in two main ways. The first way gluten is formed is through time. So if you have ever made a no-knead bread, the thing that is building our gluten structure is time. And that's because when you just let flour sit with the water or the liquid, those gluten networks are going to naturally start aligning and forming. And I actually have a little video here. If you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, you can see to demonstrate this. So let me show you that. So in this video, I am mixing flour and water together. And if you see, I kind of am pulling it up right after it's mixed and it's just completely breaking apart. There's no elasticity to it. But about 30 minutes later, I come back to this dough and I start stretching it again, and it has all this elasticity to it. And that is just from the natural gluten formation that's happening with time, which is really cool to see. So the other way gluten is formed is through mixing or kneading. So when you knead a dough or when you stir a batter a lot, that is a mechanical way of forming gluten, and that's going to build gluten a lot quicker and a lot earlier in the process. So typically with a bread dough, we would knead it because we want that gluten structure to be built really early on. I can go ahead and take a couple questions about flour and gluten really quick. We are going to keep talking about flour a little bit. I want to talk about the different types, but I know I've already covered a ton of information and I want to grab questions if I have missed any. All right, looks like I'm not seeing a ton of questions, so that's good. Hopefully you are still able to see me like on TikTok. Okay, cool. All right, so moving on to different types of flour. So wheat flour contains three parts. It contains the bran, the germ, and the endosperm. And those three parts are used to make flours in different forms. So white flour is made only from the endosperm part of the wheat because that is the lightest in color and the softest in texture and most mild in flavor part of the grain. So they remove the bran and the germ and they grind just the endosperm part of the wheat and it makes white flour. Now, whole wheat flour, on the other hand, is ground from the entire wheat grain. So you are going to have this flour that contains the bran, the germ, and the endosperm, which is going to give you something that has more nutrients, more flavor, and you know, a lot of people can prefer wheat flour, whole wheat flour for those reasons. However, you do have to be aware that whole wheat flour is coarser in texture and it absorbs more liquid because of the bran and the germ. And the other thing that's really important to note about whole wheat flour is that bran and the germ kind of act like little knives that cut through gluten structures. So it's really difficult to build a baked good that has a really nice, strong gluten structure with only whole wheat flour or with a high ratio of whole wheat flour. And that's because of the bran and the germ really cutting through those gluten structures and working against you to build that really elastic gluten network. It can be done. It just takes some really advanced techniques and a lot of knowledge about baking to do whole wheat bread, 100% whole wheat bread that's light and fluffy and has that really strong gluten structure. There are a few different types of white flour that we should discuss. And if you're watching from outside of the US, this may not apply to you. But in the US, we do have either bleached or unbleached flour. And when flour is first milled, it has this natural slight yellow tint to it, and consumers don't find this appealing. So flour either goes through a natural aging process or it is chemically bleached. So both of these processes are going to make a flour that's lighter in texture and lighter in color. But Unbleached flour just goes through that process naturally, and then bleached flour goes through a chemical process to reach that stage. So therefore, unbleached flour typically is a bit more expensive to buy because it takes longer to make, because it has to go through this process naturally. Where bleached flour, flour millers don't have to hold on to it as long. They can just go through the chemical bleaching process, and then it's ready to sell. So typically bleached flour is easier, or is a bit cheaper to buy. The other thing to note about bleached flour is that it does have a subtle flavor and smell to it that's a little bit acidic. Some people really notice this and do not like it. Some people actually prefer it. So a lot of this is just personal preference. But really, either bleached or unbleached flour can be used for most everyday baking. But I prefer to keep unbleached all-purpose flour on hand because I find it is a bit more versatile. So because bleached flour, the protein structure actually gets a little bit weaker through the chemical process. So if you want to make bread, it's really difficult to make a bread with a really strong gluten structure because those proteins are weaker from the bleached flour. So I just tend to prefer unbleached. I find it a little bit more versatile. You can still make bread with bleached flour. A lot of it is just what you can find in your own personal preference. Let's see. Stephen is asking, does bleached flour have a taste or taste any different? So bleached flour that is just the all-purpose bleached flour can taste a little bit different, but where you're really going to notice it is in something like a cake flour. Cake flour is very, very heavily bleached because for cakes, we want that really, weak gluten structure because we don't want a super chewy cake. So cake flour, I don't know if you've ever smelled cake flour, but if you have some on hand, just smell it. You will notice it smells very different than just regular all-purpose flour, and that is from the heavy bleaching. And therefore, it does have a slight taste to it. It's just a little bit acidic. I actually really like it in cakes, but again, it's a personal preference. All right, moving on. I just want to quickly review the different varieties of wheat flour that you're going to find and likely work with if you bake a lot, and what they're good for and how they differ. So, of course, wheat flour is made in this wide range of flours, and the most common that you're going to see is all-purpose flour or plain flour, and this has a moderate protein content, around 9.5 to 11%, and like we discussed before, the protein is what creates the gluten. So that moderate protein content is going to be good for really most everyday baking uses. You can use it for cookies, cakes, brownies, bars, pies, really anything. It's going to work pretty well for it. Now, in contrast, we have bread flour, which has a higher protein content. It typically sits around 12 to 14%. And that's because for bread, we want that bigger, stronger gluten structure. So really the best use for bread flour is bread, just like what its name suggests. It's pretty much a no-brainer. On the other end of the spectrum, we have cake flour. So cake flour contains a lower protein content, usually around 6.5 to 8%. And its best uses are for really delicate pastries or cakes. So I really because I bake very frequently, I like to keep those three flours on hand pretty much at all times. And then that way I have the most versatility with my flours. Another flour of note is what's called self-rising flour. So self-rising flour is actually a combination of ingredients. It's a combination of all-purpose flour already pre-mixed with salt and baking powder. So we're going to talk a little bit about baking powder later in the discussion, but baking powder is a chemical leavener, which is different from yeast. So I think the name of self-rising flour has kind of given it this common misconception that you can use self-rising flour in bread in place of yeast, and it really does not work that way. But you can use it in something like a biscuit, and you already have your flour, salt, and baking powder in your recipe. And then all you need to do is add some butter and some buttermilk, and you have biscuits. So it can be a nice flour to have on hand if you bake a lot of things like biscuits or scones or quick breads. I don't typically have it on hand. It's used a lot in the South in the US. I should also note that if you live outside of the US, there may be available to you a flour called self-raising flour, which is different than self-rising flour. And self-raising flour is a combination of all-purpose flour and baking powder, but there's no salt in it. So just something to note. And then as we discussed earlier, whole wheat flour. So whole wheat flour has that protein content similar to bread flour, around 12 to 14%. But like we discussed before, because of in the germ in the wheat flour, it's more difficult to build that stronger gluten structure. So even that, higher protein content, it's not going to a stronger gluten structure. So just something to note. I like to use whole wheat flour substituted in for small amounts of white flour. I don't typically use really high ratios of whole wheat flour because things can just start getting a lot more dense. So I like to just use it in smaller quantities to add some extra flavor and nutrition. Before we move on to talking about fats and fats functions, are there any other questions about flour before we move on? I know that was a lot of information very quickly. Let's see if I have any questions that I missed in the chat here. Can I talk a little bit about OO flour and the difference between all-purpose flour? So OO flour is a flour that has been more finely milled, and it also still has a higher protein content. So cake flour is really, really finely milled and heavily bleached, but it also has a low protein content. Whereas OO flour does have that more finer mill to it, but what OO pizza crust. It's a little difficult to find. You can sometimes find it in specialty markets, or you might have to order it online. What about einkorn? So einkorn also has that low protein content, so you're not able to build a really strong gluten structure with it. Does sifting flour make a difference? So a couple of people are saying it's breaking up. Goodness, it says I'm going good here. Is it getting any better, or is it still breaking up a lot? Before I keep talking. Oh no, that's not good. Okay, it's better. I closed out of a couple tabs. Maybe it's getting better. So this will be recorded. I'm using a program that's going to record the whole thing completely. So even if it doesn't go through well on whatever platform you're watching on, hopefully it should be better now. When the recording goes out, it should still be good. Okay, it's getting better again. Okay, good. I closed out of a few tabs just in case that was affecting it. I had a bunch of live streams pulled up, but okay. So somebody asked if sifting flour makes a difference. So sifting your flour can make a difference for specific things. So I always suggest sifting your flour if you're making a cake. Cake really needs that like light texture and airy texture. And if you don't sift it, it can just be a lot heavier. And I do think it makes a difference with cake. But for something like a cookie or a bread or a brownie, I don't find it really necessary. Just give it like a really good whisk and that should be good for you. I also always suggest sifting things like cocoa powder or powdered sugar because those tend to really clump a lot. So sifting can really help break it up and can help. Okay, back to the einkorn. People missed that part. Einkorn is considered an ancient wheat. So it's one of the original forms of wheat. It's not the same as the wheat that we typically grow nowadays. And it has a lot of really nice flavor and texture. It's different than our traditional wheat that you might find now. But again, it has that lower protein content, so it's not going to build a really strong gluten structure. If you want to incorporate some einkorn in something like your bread, similar to whole wheat, just use a little bit of it in place of your white flour, like maybe up to a quarter of the amount of flour. I wouldn't go much farther than that. Okay, let's talk about fats. So I would say fats are maybe the next most important ingredient in traditional baking. I mean, all of the ingredients we're talking about today are very important, but fat plays a huge role in the structure and the texture of our baked goods. So not only does fat just add a lot of richness to our baked goods, but it helps keep baked goods moist, and it actually plays a pretty big role in how our baked goods rise and how they're leavened. So the first role that fat plays is richness, flavor, and moisture. It is going to keep things just really flavorful, plain and simple. Something that has a lot of fat in it is going to taste better typically than something that doesn't have a lot of fat in it. Plain and simple. It also helps keep things tender, and that's because fat is just a really powerful tenderizer. It creates this barrier between the proteins in flour and the moisture that you're going to add into your baked goods, and that little barrier is going to help slow down gluten development. And as we said, once the moisture gets in contact with the flour, that's when gluten immediately starts forming. So when you have fat incorporated into your baked good, that slows things down. And fat actually helps to shorten gluten strands. So if you are familiar with the vegetable fat called shortening, that's actually where its name comes from, is because it actually shortens the gluten strands. So another good example to think about this is if you look at a bread that has no fat in it. So something like a baguette, which has no fat in the dough, and you compare that to something that has a lot of fat in it, like a brioche bread, you can see how one is a lot chewier and a lot more crusty, whereas the bread with a lot of fat is a lot more tender and soft. But fat also plays a pretty big role in how things are leavened. So especially solid fat, we're talking butter, shortening, lard, those things are going to be creamed with sugar, and this helps trap a web of air in the baked good. And that is really important to help leaven. Now we have a whole leavening section coming up, so I'll talk more about that, but just keep in mind that that is really important. And then when you are working with butter, butter is not 100% fat. Butter sits around like 81 to 83% fat. And so the rest of that is water. So when you bake with butter, the water is going to evaporate off, which creates steam, which helps things rise. And so that is another way that fat functions as leavening. Let's quickly review some of the types of fat. There are two kind of categories of fat. There are liquid fats and there are solid fats. So solid fats can always be melted into a liquid form. However, they do re-solidify when they're cooled, so they do function slightly differently than true liquid fats. Butter is the most common type of solid fat, and it adds really great flavor to our baked goods. I think that's probably why it's the most common fat in baking, because it just adds such a great flavor. And like I said before, it's kind of in the 80 to 83% range with the water being added to it. So it helps with leavening. And another benefit of butter is that it has the melting point around 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 32 to 35 degrees Celsius. So this means that when you eat something with butter, that fat literally melts in your mouth. So it's not going to leave this really like filmy kind of texture in your mouth after you eat it, because the fat melts as you eat it. I do want to note, keep in mind, things like margarines and whipped buttery spreads are not the same as true butter. Those can contain as little as 35% fat because they whip tons of air into them. And so they're not a great substitution for real butter. They can cause lots of issues with your baked goods. Quickly, a note about salted versus unsalted butter. The only difference between the two is that there is salt added to salted butter. That's really it. I prefer to bake with unsalted butter because I like to control the amount of salt that I put in my baked goods. But that is just a personal preference. If you keep only salted butter on hand, you can make adjustments to your recipe. For every one stick, which is 113 grams of butter, there is about a 1/4 teaspoon of salt in that butter. So if, knowing that if you only have salted butter on hand, you can make that adjustment and just reduce the salt a little bit if your recipe is calling for unsalted butter. Let's quickly talk about vegetable shortening. So vegetable shortening is a hydrogenated fat made from vegetable oils. And this process of hydrogenating the oil makes it solid form. And shortening is 100% fat, in contrast to butter, which is in the 80% range. So this means that it creates a baked good that's more tender than when working with only butter. But it also, it also prevents pastries like pie crust from shrinking. And that is because of that lack of water evaporating out of it. Because it's 100% fat, there's no water evaporating off of it. So it can help with things not shrinking as much. Vegetable shortening does have a melting point, though, around 118 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 48 degrees Celsius. So considerably higher than butter. So this can be some benefit to you if you want to make like cookies that don't spread out as much. Shortening can be really helpful for that because they're going to hold their shape for longer in the oven before the fat melts and spreads the cookie out. But the downside of it is that it can leave that really greasy film in your mouth because it does not melt at body temperature. So when you eat it, you can kind of like feel it in your mouth. And some people really don't like that. Lard functions very similarly to vegetable shortening. Lard kind of got a really bad name in the 90s because, people think it's unhealthy for you. Lard, I don't consider lard any more unhealthy than any other fat. I really like to bake with lard, especially for savory things. If I'm going to make biscuits and put sausage gravy on it, or if I'm going to make a savory pie, I love working with lard. It's also 100% fat. Lard is fat that is rendered from a pig. So even, if you cook bacon down and you save your grease, that is technically lard. It's, more flavorful than just regular lard. But I like to save my bacon grease, add it into biscuits and things like that. But there's also a type of lard that is called leaf lard, and it's a really snowy white form of lard. You can typically find it in the grocery store or online, and it's extremely mild in flavor. So it's really nice to use in baked goods where you don't want that kind of porky flavor added to it. And if you've never tried lard before and you're not a vegetarian, you might try it. It's really delicious. All right, so let's quickly talk about some oils, and then I'll get to some fat questions before we move on to sugar. So oils are all of our liquid fats, anything that is in a liquid oil form. So canola oil, vegetable oil, safflower oil, grapeseed oil, olive oil. Those are all of our liquid fats. And they all essentially function the same way in baking because they stay liquid when they cool, and they're all 100% fat. So they cannot really do any of the leavening that our solid fats can do, but they can still add a lot of moisture and tenderness to our baked goods. And things that are made with oil tend to stay more tender once they're cooled, and that's because the oil does not solidify. So if you have ever had an oil-based cake and you put that side by side, something that's a butter-based cake, like a pound cake, the oil-based cake is going to be much more tender and moist once it's cooled than the butter-based cake. And that's because the butter is going to solidify once it cools down. As a general rule of thumb, you don't want to substitute liquid fats for solid fats. Now, if you're really in a bind, solid fats can always be melted down into liquid fat form if you need that. If you're, for instance, if you're making muffins and it calls for oil and you don't have oil, you can melt your butter and let it cool a little bit and use that in place of the oil. But you should never substitute liquid fat in place of solid fat. And that's because of all of the scientific roles that solid fat plays in baking, liquid fats cannot replicate that. So that's something to really keep in mind. Okay, before we move on to sugar, I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in. When baking with brown butter, would you weigh before or after baking? I find a pretty big difference because the water evaporates. Would it be okay to brown the butter in bulk and refrigerate for future use? So for brown butter, it kind of depends on how your recipe is written. If your recipe is written for you to already use brown butter, then you will use the amount of butter the recipe has, brown it, and then that's the amount you put in your recipe because it is written and tested to be used with brown butter. If you are converting a recipe that doesn't call for brown butter, it calls for regular butter, and you want to use brown butter, you do need to take the weight after. So I will typically either brown a little extra butter and then weigh it after it's browned and try to get the right amount. Or sometimes I'll just throw like an ice cube into the butter after it's been browned to add that extra water back into it. And then that can kind of make up for it. So that's up to you. There is an article on my website. If you go to bakerbetty.com and search for brown butter, I have a whole article about how to brown butter and how to substitute it in baking. I don't like keeping large batches of it in the refrigerator unless that entire batch is going to go in one batch of baked goods. That's because the fat solids are going to sink to the bottom, and that's where most of the flavor lies in brown butter. So if you're going and, say you have this big batch of brown butter and you just need like a fourth of it, it's kind of difficult to then, make sure you're getting enough of those milk solids that have sunk down to the bottom to be in your recipe, and it can be kind of different. So it's not the best to do large batches of it unless that entire large batch is going into one batch of baked good or whatever you're making. Is it better to use regular butter or European butter? It depends on what you're making. So European style butters tend to have the higher fat. So they typically sit around 82 to 83%, whereas American style butter is typically on the 80% range. So if you have something where you really want that really rich butter flavor and butter is kind of the star of the show, for instance, something like a puff pastry or a croissant, then yeah, you might want to go ahead and splurge for the European style butter because butter is the star of the show. But I don't splurge on things like that for other things where the other flavors are, more of the focus. So if I'm making something like a brownie or a chocolate chip cookie, I'm really more focused on the vanilla in the cookie and the chocolate chips in the cookie. And so I'm not going to typically splurge on the higher quality butter for that or the higher fat butter. But that's, a personal preference. Let's make sure I'm seeing. When a recipe calls for melted butter, should you weigh it after it's melted? So if the recipe already calls for melted butter, you take the weight that it lists of the butter and then you melt it down, and then you don't need to reweigh it. It'll just be whatever it calls for. Does brown butter affect the texture or just flavor? It can kind of affect the texture because you did evaporate all of that water off of it. If you are adapting a recipe, you need to use the brown butter in the original form that it asked for in the recipe. So if you're making cookies and you needed soft, solid butter, you need to brown the butter, let it cool, let it come back to that solid state so that it's in that form that it needs. Okay. I think I got most of the questions there. Let's move on to sugar. So sugar's most prominent function in baking is obviously to sweeten our baked goods. Seems pretty straightforward, but it does have a lot of other scientific roles in how it works to form the structure and the color and the texture of our baked goods. So right now we're just talking about solid sugars. Liquid sugars such as honey, maple syrup, those types of things function very differently than solid sugars. So right now we're just talking about solid sugar. So its main function, like we said, is to sweeten and flavor. Granulated sugar is very neutral in flavor, but things like brown sugar have a lot more flavor in them because they contain molasses. So that's going to add some flavor to our baked goods. The next function of sugar is to encourage browning. So because sugar caramelizes as it's heated, it will help your baked goods to brown. So a baked good that has a high ratio of sugar is going to brown much more readily than a baked good that has little to no sugar in it. And that's because of the caramelizing process. Sugar is also hygroscopic in nature. So that means that it grabs and holds on to moisture. So baked goods that have a high ratio of sugar are going to stale less quickly than baked goods that have no sugar. And that's because they're holding on to that moisture, and it really helps keep your baked goods moist. Sugar also acts as a tenderizer, and this kind of goes back to what we've already discussed about gluten and how gluten is formed. Because sugar is holding on to that moisture, it's leaving less readily available for the flour to absorb and create gluten with. So it helps keep things a lot more tender. And then it is a big part of leavening in baking, and that's because sugar is often creamed with butter, or it's whipped with eggs or heavy cream, and that is going to force a web of air to get trapped between sugar and the other ingredient, and this is going to help lighten and leaven our baked goods. So let's quickly review a couple of the different types of sugar, just so we're all on the same page about that. So granulated sugar is white sugar. It's a refined sugar. It's very neutral in flavor, and it's used probably the most commonly in baking in the US. And then if you live outside the US, specifically if you live in the UK, you have a similar sugar called castor sugar. And in the US, we would see that labeled as superfine sugar. And this is very similar to granulated sugar, but it's ground a little bit smaller than granulated sugar. And you can typically exchange the two. If you see a recipe that calls for granulated sugar, you can use castor sugar or vice versa. It's not really going to affect it much. But if you want to make your own superfine sugar, you can put granulated sugar in a food processor, give it a couple of pulses, and that will give you a bit of a finer grain. Because superfine sugar in the US is really only sold in like very small packets. Whereas, in the UK, you can find it much more readily available. So both of these types of sugar are forms of cane sugar. They're made from cane sugar. All right, moving on to brown sugar. So there are two types of brown sugar. There is light brown sugar and there is dark brown sugar. So both of these sugars are granulated sugar that has had molasses added back to it. Molasses is a byproduct of refining sugar. So to make brown sugar, they put the molasses back into it. So light brown sugar has a smaller quantity of molasses and dark brown sugar has a higher quantity of molasses. I'm sorry if you can hear the stomping. My upstairs neighbor is being very loud right now. Hopefully that's not too distracting. So this is kind of a personal preference, which one you're going to use. Some recipes will specify which one to use. I tend to use dark brown sugar. I just like the extra flavor that it brings. And molasses is even more hygroscopic than regular sugar. And so it is going to keep things even more moist and more chewy. So especially if I'm making something like cookies, I really like the dark brown sugar because it helps keep them really chewy and nice and moist. The other important thing to note about brown sugar is that molasses is acidic in nature. And we're going to talk about this more in our leavening section, but acid is really necessary whenever we're working with baking soda in our baked goods. So a lot of times brown sugar is used in a recipe because of its acidic nature. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit, but just keep that in your mind. And then our last main sugar that we're going to talk about is powdered sugar. Powdered sugar is also made from cane sugar. It's ground very fine. You might also see it labeled as confectioner's sugar or icing sugar or 10x sugar. The 10x comes from the fact that it is ground 10 times finer than granulated sugar. And powdered sugar is also always mixed with some kind of anti-caking agent. So something like cornstarch, and that is to help it from clumping because brown sugar is ground, or powdered sugar is ground so finely that it's going to just clump so bad if it doesn't have some kind of starch in it. And because powdered sugar does have a starch in it, baked goods made with powdered sugar are typically very, very tender. So something to note. Let me see if I'm missing any questions before we move on to our egg section. You're tuning in late. Yes. So if you're tuning in late, the recording will be saved to my YouTube and my Baker Betty Facebook page. So you'll be able to watch from the beginning. You won't be able to watch from the beginning until this live stream ends. But just something to keep in mind. So because sugar is made more fine, can it be used when you're using powdered sugar? So what's the texture? Sorry, I'm trying to understand this question. So no, castor sugar is much coarser in texture than powdered sugar. Powdered sugar is very, very, very fine. If you put castor sugar and granulated sugar side by side, you really wouldn't see too much of a difference. It does have a bit of a finer grain, but it's not super, super noticeable. So those two are easy to interchange, but you really don't want to use castor sugar in place of powdered sugar. If you need to make powdered sugar, there are recipes online. I can't think of the exact ratio off the top of my head, but what you're going to do is you're going to take either granulated sugar or powdered sugar, put it in your food processor, and let it go for quite a while until it becomes a really fine powder. And then you have to mix it with some cornstarch or some kind of anti-caking agent. So just that's what you would need to do if you don't have powdered sugar on hand. Okay. Let's move on to, sorry, making sure I didn't miss any questions over here. You pre-ordered the book. Thank you so much for pre-ordering the book. That's so sweet of you. I really hope you love it. You're getting a sneak peek at some of the content that's in the book right now. Okay, let's talk about eggs. We're still talking about ingredient functions. There's a lot in this section, but things will move really quickly once we finish with ingredient functions. So let's quickly talk about eggs. Eggs are utilized in 3 different forms in baking. So they are utilized as a whole egg, as egg whites, or egg yolks. And depending on which form you're using, they have different roles and functions. So a whole egg is made up of quite a bit of water, but as well as protein and fat. And so these 3 things really work together to perform a few different functions in baking. The main function being is that they work as a binder. They really help hold things together with our baked goods. And because of the protein content and how the egg yolk gels, that's what really helps bind things. They also just add some structure and strength to our baked goods. Whole eggs are also a really big part of what helps leaven baked goods, and that's because there's so much water in them that water evaporates off, and that is going to create steam and help lift and leaven our baked goods. They add a lot of flavor and color and richness. And then because of the fat in whole eggs, they also help to tenderize and moisturize our baked goods. Okay, let's quickly talk about egg whites. Oh, whoops, go back. Okay. Egg whites are about 2/3 of the total volume of an egg, and it's made up mostly of water, but some protein. And egg whites do not contain any fat, and so therefore they function very differently than egg yolks. They are going to help lighten and leaven. Egg whites can be whipped into a foam and can increase in volume a great deal. And so often you'll see them whipped into a foam like a meringue, and then that is folded into a cake batter to help lighten and leaven. And that is just a really big part of how a lot of baked goods are leavened. But egg whites also help create crispness if they're used by themselves in baked goods. And that's because, again, of the water present in the egg white and the absence of fat. It just tends to kind of have a drying effect on your baked goods. So it can kind of create a crispy texture. And you can think about things like a pavlova or a meringue cookie as a good example of how egg whites can really help crisp things up. And function of egg yolks, because they really have mostly fat in them and some protein, they function much differently than the egg whites. Their biggest function is to add richness to our baked goods because of that fat content, but they're also really great emulsifiers. And you can really see how this works if you make something like a custard, something like a pastry cream or a custard ice cream. The egg yolks are really going to help homogenize that mixture and thicken it up and gel it together. Egg yolks are, of course, going to add some flavor and color to our baked goods. And then they're going to add really great moisture, again, because of the fat that's present in them. So that's really it with eggs. Again, 3 different functions depending on which form you're using them in. How do you know how many eggs to use in a recipe and how much of each, meaning egg and white? I mean, your recipe should tell you. If it's a well-written recipe, it should tell you the number of eggs to use. Most recipes are written with large eggs in mind. A large egg, once it's cracked, the full egg weighs about 50 grams. So if your recipe is calling for weight measurements for your eggs, you can use that as kind of your general rule of thumb. 50 grams for 1 large egg. So if your recipe says 150 grams of egg, you're probably going to need about 3 eggs. I typically always write my recipes stating the amount of eggs because it's just more practical. What's my favorite thing to do with separated whites after you've used the yolks? You can freeze the whites. So often I'll put them in like a deli container and label it like, 4 egg whites with the date on it, put it in the freezer. And then if I need to make meringue later on, I can pull those out and make them. Egg whites can be used for meringue cookies, for pavlova, for like a chiffon cake or a sponge cake, or macarons. There's so many uses for egg whites. So if you don't have to use them immediately. You can throw them in your freezer. Yes, the session is recorded. It will be posted as soon as this session is over. You'll be able to watch the whole thing. Does the freshness of egg affect the quality of your product? It can. It depends on what you're making. If you're making something like a poached egg, a fresh egg is going to work much better. And that's just because the white is going to be tighter and it's going to hold together a little bit better. But on the other hand, if you're making something like a macaron, you actually kind of want the eggs to be a bit older. It's going to help your meringue create the batter in a way that's not going to crack as much. I don't really know the science behind that, but it's just kind of a general consensus that older egg whites work better for macarons. So it just kind of depends. You can freeze egg yolks too, but because they're higher fat, they don't really get solid, and you wouldn't really want to keep them for too long, like probably maybe 2 months or so. Okay, let's move on to leaveners. So leavening refers to the gases that are trapped in our baked goods when it is baked. So there are numerous ways that baked goods are leavened, and whatever method you utilize, leavening is just such an important part of almost all baked goods. So there are kind of 3 main categories of leavening that we use in baking, and those are chemical leavening, which is baking powder and baking soda, physical leavening, which is air and steam, and then biological leavening, which is yeast. So let's talk about chemical leavening first. So both baking soda and baking powder are forms of chemical leavening. And when they are added to our baked goods, a chemical reaction occurs and it produces carbon dioxide. And this gas is going to get trapped in the structure of our baked good as it bakes to leaven it. Now, there are 2 main points in which chemical leaveners react: when they are in contact with an acidic ingredient and when they are heated. Yes, there is a handout for this. I'm not sure if I think you're watching on YouTube. There's a pinned comment. If you go to the pinned comment, you can click on the link and there is a handout if you want to reference it. So baking soda is also known as sodium bicarbonate or bicarbonate of soda, and it is alkaline on the pH scale. So because of this, it needs an acidic ingredient in the recipe to interact with. If a recipe does not have an acidic ingredient in it, the baking soda is not going to start creating those CO2 gases until well into the baking process, at which point it's typically too late and it's not going to fully leaven your baked good. On the other, and additionally, baking soda is going to leave a bit of a bitter or a metallic aftertaste in your mouth if it does not have an acidic ingredient to neutralize it. So those are 2 reasons why it's really important for baking soda to have an acidic ingredient in the recipe. Baking soda is about 4 times more powerful by volume than baking powder. So typically, if your recipe is calling for baking soda, you're going to notice it's a much smaller amount than the typical amount of what a recipe calling for baking powder is going to call for. So some of the most common acidic ingredients that you're going to see used in a recipe to interact with baking soda are brown sugar, like we discussed because of the molasses in it, buttermilk, sour cream and yogurt, cream of tartar, natural cocoa powder, but not Dutch processed cocoa powder. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And then melted chocolate. It's not going to interact with like a solid chocolate chip or something like that. It would have to be melted chocolate. Molasses, honey, lemon juice, vinegar. So those are the most common ingredients you might see in your recipe that will activate your baking soda. So on the other hand, baking powder is a complete leavening system, which means it is a combination of baking soda and acidic ingredients. So baking powder does not need another acidic ingredient in the recipe in order to properly leaven your baked goods. It's going to begin reacting as soon as it's hydrated. So most baking powder is also double acting, and that means that it contains 2 acidic ingredients. So the first one is going to activate when it's hydrated with a liquid, and then the second one is going to activate with heat. So you kind of get this 2 bursts of activity, and it's going to, I said earlier that baking soda will also start reacting with heat, but it needs much more heat than what the double acting baking powder needs for that second burst of leavening. Let's quickly talk about physical leavening. So physical leavening includes air and steam. And while these 2 things might not seem all that exciting, they are really powerful forms of leavening. So air is one of the most common instances of leavening, and you're going to see this when butter and sugar are creamed together. And this process is called creaming, and it's forcing air to get trapped between sugar and fat, and it creates this web of air, and that increases in volume, and that is going to help leaven baked goods, things like cookies, cakes, but also it gets trapped in things like whipped cream that can then be used to be folded into something like a mousse, and that is going to really lighten our baked good. The other form of physical leavening is steam, and this is a very powerful form of leavening because when water evaporates and turns to steam, it actually increases in volume by 1,500 times. And so it can really produce this great amount of volume in our baked goods. And I like to use puff pastry as a really good example of this. And that's because puff pastry is what's called a laminated dough. So it is formed in a way in which there are lots of alternating layers of dough and butter, dough and butter, dough and butter, tons of them. And so when it goes into the oven, that butter is going to melt. The water from the butter is going to evaporate off, and that is what creates all of the puff in our baked goods. And I have a little video here to show you. There is no baking powder, no baking soda in this puff pastry. The only thing that is leavening it is steam, and you can just see how big this puffs up. So it can really do such a great deal of leavening. And then our last, we're not switching here. All right, and our last form of leavening is biological leavening. And so that is yeast. And we call it biological leavening. That's because it is alive. Yeast is a fungus, and it, is a living organism, and that's how it is leavening our baked goods that have yeast in it. So there are 3 different forms of yeast that are used in baking. We're mostly going to talk about dry yeast today, but dry yeast comes in active dry and instant yeast. And then there's also fresh yeast, which is a cake yeast that is really moist and kept in the refrigerator section of the grocery store. It's a highly perishable item. It really only lasts for about a week to 10 days. So it's not as commonly used as dried yeast because it has such a shorter shelf life. And then there's natural yeast, which is something like a sourdough starter. We're going to capture yeast from the flour and the air, and then that is used to leaven bread. Dry yeast is the most common yeast used for baking, and it is a very specific strain of yeast that is cultivated for its ability to work super quickly and efficiently to make bread rise. And you might think that, well, most bread recipes are going to call for, at least an hour for the first rise, probably another hour for the second rise. 2 hours doesn't sound that quick. But in yeast world, that is very, very quick. In comparison to something like a natural yeast starter, usually things are going to rise for, maybe 12 hours total for something like that or more. So it just works super, super efficiently. Dried yeast is just yeast cells that have been dried out. So therefore they're in a dormant state because yeast needs 2 different things to thrive. It needs moisture and it needs a food source. So dried yeast does not have either of those things present. So it's just asleep until you hydrate it and put it in your dough and it wakes up. Active dry yeast and instant yeast, which you might also see instant yeast labels as quick rising yeast or rapid rise yeast, both of those function essentially the same. The only difference is the rate of activity. Active dry yeast contains larger yeast cells, so they just function a little bit slower than the smaller yeast cells that are in instant yeast. And you might hear people say that active dry yeast has to be hydrated before you put it in your baked good, but it actually doesn't have to be. The original form of active dry yeast had to be hydrated, but it does not any longer. If you want, you can just throw it right into your dry ingredients, just like you would with your instant yeast, and you are good to go. They can pretty much be used interchangeably, but just be aware that active dry yeast is going to about double your rising times as compared to instant yeast. And that can be a good thing. When things ferment more slowly, they have more flavor. So whichever one you want to use is kind of a personal preference, but if you have time, I do suggest using active dry yeast because it does function more slowly and you're going to have a more flavorful bread. So let's talk quickly about how yeast functions. Like we just mentioned, yeast needs two things to thrive: moisture and a food source. The food that yeast thrives on is sugar. So that is the thing that it's going to start eating and producing carbon dioxide gas from. But there does not actually have to be sugar in your bread dough in order for it to have a food source. The starches in flour will start converting into simple sugars as soon as they are hydrated. So if you have a bread recipe that doesn't have any sugar in it, that is still going to have food for your yeast, and it's still going to be able to wake up and produce those carbon dioxide gases. When yeast is put into a bread dough, a dried yeast is put into a bread dough, the moisture is going to wake it up, and then it's going to start feeding on those sugars. And this process is called fermentation. It is what leavens and flavors our bread through the production of the carbon dioxide gas and alcohols. Yeast is also extremely sensitive to temperature. So cold temperatures really slow down yeast activity, and warm temperatures really speed up yeast activity. So that's something to keep in mind whenever you are trying to control the speed of your dough. If you need things to move a little quicker, find a warmer spot for your dough. If you need to slow things down, find a cooler spot for your dough. You can even use your refrigerator to really slow things down. But do be aware that yeast begins to die around 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 60 degrees Celsius. So you do need to be careful about things getting too hot, especially with the liquid that you add into your bread dough. So typically, if you're adding your liquid, if your yeast is in your dry ingredients and you're adding your liquid into your whole amount of dry ingredients, typically you want your liquid to be around 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 49 to 54 degrees Celsius. If you are going to be proofing your yeast, which we'll talk about here in a second, which means you're putting your yeast directly into the liquid, you want it to be a little cooler. So about 110 to 115 degrees Fahrenheit or 43 to 46 degrees Celsius. So a little bit warmer if the yeast is in the dry ingredients, a little cooler if you're going directly into the liquid. Thank you so much for the heart. It was very sweet of you. Okay, so let's talk about proofing yeast. So proofing yeast is a way to make sure your yeast is alive and sort of give yourself a little bit of a jump start on its activity. So the process of proofing yeast is when you add your yeast into warm liquid and then you give it a pinch of sugar. And the liquid is going to hydrate the yeast and wake it up. And then the sugar is going to give it food to wake up to. And you're just going to sit and let it work for about 5 to 10 minutes. And what you're looking for is signs of life. It's going to look like foaming on top. It's going to look like, you can see in this picture here, it's going to look like almost like it's being carbonated, because it is being carbonated. The yeast is feeding and creating carbon dioxide gas, and you'll see these little tiny bubbles popping to the top. It's not going to be super dramatic. You have to kind of really look for it, but that is a sign that your yeast is alive. You can go ahead and add it to your bread dough, and it's going to make your bread dough rise. This is really good to do if you're a new bread baker and you're kind of nervous about yeast and you're nervous about killing it. You should be good to go if you see the signs of life after you proof it. You can do this in any bread recipe, even if it doesn't call for proofing your yeast. So you're just going to take the liquid from the recipe. You don't have to use all of the liquid from the recipe, at least like a half of a cup of the liquid from the recipe, or you can use all of it. You're going to warm it up to about 110 degrees Fahrenheit. You're going to add your yeast, add a big pinch of sugar, a couple pinches of sugar, and watch for its activity. Once you see the activity, then you can go ahead and add it into your dough, and you know it's going to make your bread dough rise. And it also gets things moving a little quicker. So if you're kind of in a hurry and you need your bread dough to move really quickly, this is a great thing to do to just kind of get it moving. Okay, let me answer some yeast questions before we move on. I'm so glad Sarah says she's coming away with a lot of needed information. I'm so great. So glad. At what point can you overnight proof bread in the refrigerator? So there is a step in bread baking that you can use called retardation, and that's where you put your bread dough in the refrigerator. There are 2 points in the process which you can do this. You can do this during the bulk fermentation phase, which is the first rise that your dough goes through. And you can like just mix your dough, and before it goes to that first rise, put it in the refrigerator. You have a much longer time frame in which it can stay in the refrigerator if it's during the bulk fermentation, because your dough is not shaped yet and you're not risking overproofing it. So you can also put your dough in the refrigerator after you have shaped it, which is during the proofing phase. And you can put that in the refrigerator. You shape your dough, put it in the refrigerator. And usually you can go like maybe 16 to 18 hours after you have shaped it. And that's because the dough has already been formed and you can risk overproofing it at that point. So it's a little bit of a shorter time frame. If you do it during the bulk fermentation phase, so before it's shaped, you can go up to like 3 or 4 days. You can leave it in there for a long time. And so your dough is not going to completely stop rising. It will still rise very slowly, but it's going to have a lot more flavor, and it can also just make your timeline a lot more flexible. Let me make sure. Okay. Any other yeast questions? I do have a lemon cake recipe, a lemon chiffon cake recipe on my site. Somebody was asking for a lemon cake recipe. Chiffon cake is one of my favorite types of cake because it's super light and tender, but also super moist. And there's, if you just go to bakerbetty.com and look for lemon chiffon cake, you'll find it. Okay, let's quickly talk about dairy products. And I think this is our last ingredient function. And then we'll be zooming through the rest. Okay, so the main function of dairy is to, sorry, real quick. Can I refrigerate during both steps? Yes, you can. You can refrigerate during both steps if you want to, for sure. So the main function of most dairy products are to add moisture to our baked goods and sometimes flavor and some richness. So milk's main function in baking is really just moisture. And then depending on how much fat is in the type of milk you're using, sometimes it's also to add some richness and tenderness. So in general, milk that's like low fat, 1%, 2%, those can all be used interchangeably and can also be easily substituted with a non-dairy milk because we're not really relying much on the fat in those types of milk to do much in the recipe. Where in contrast, if you have a recipe that calls for whole milk, half and half, or cream, those things are going to really rely more heavily on the fat that's in it. And so you really shouldn't try to substitute them with a lower fat option. If you need to make a substitution to a non-dairy option, you would want to find an option that is also similar in fat to what is being called for in the recipe. Heavy cream, whipping cream, double cream are all types of milk that have at least 30% butter fat in them. And that is going to allow them to be whipped into a foam. They can hold air within them. And so they're used a lot for moisture and richness, and then they're also used to lighten and leaven things. If you have a recipe that's calling for you to whip air into your cream, you're not going to be able to do that if you try to substitute it with a lower fat milk. That fat is needed to hold the air in it. Cultured dairy products are things like sour cream, buttermilk, and yogurt. Those are all cultured dairy products. And they are acidic in nature because of the fact that they're cultured. And so these products are used really frequently to activate baking soda. Like we talked about, baking soda needs that acidity in order to function properly. And they also add lots of moisture and kind of like a tangy flavor to baked goods, and that's because of that acidity. These products can kind of be swapped for each other if they are in similar consistencies. So if your baked good calls for plain yogurt and you only have sour cream on hand, you can swap those because they're similar in texture. Now, you might see really frequently if something calls for buttermilk, a lot of times recipes will call buttermilk substitutes something like taking regular milk and adding either lemon juice or vinegar to it to create this buttermilk substitute. You can do that and it works a little bit. I don't personally like this substitute because the texture of it is much different than true buttermilk. Buttermilk is a very thick and rich product. So my favorite substitute for buttermilk is to take either yogurt or sour cream and add a little bit of water to it to thin it down till it's about the consistency of buttermilk. Usually the ratio that I use is for, if my recipe calls for a cup of buttermilk, I'll use 3/4 of a cup of either sour cream or yogurt and add about a 1/4 cup of water and whisk that together really well. That's a great buttermilk substitute. They also sell dried buttermilk powder that you can keep in your pantry if you don't use buttermilk a lot. And then you always have it on hand. You just reconstitute it with a little bit of water, and that's a really great use for buttermilk as well. Quickly, just a few other important ingredients to note. Salt is an extremely important ingredient in baking. It's very underrated. Baked goods that are made without salt are going to taste so flat and boring. Salt really enhances and balances flavor, especially sweetness. Things are actually going to taste so overly sweet if you don't put enough salt in your baked good. I personally really prefer to use kosher salt in all of my cooking and baking. With the exception of cake, I like to use a fine sea salt with cake because I want it to dissolve more into my batter. But I really like the coarser texture of kosher salt for most other baking, cookies, brownies, pie crust. I really like that it has like that bigger flake. And so you get little hits of salt throughout the baked good. If you use table salt for your baking and your recipe calls for kosher salt or fine sea salt, you're going to want to reduce the amount of salt in your recipe by about half because table salt is much more salty by volume as compared to those other types of salt. Extracts and spices in baking really only serve the purpose of flavoring our baked goods. So things like vanilla or almond extract or cinnamon, all of those things are not really contributing to the structure or the chemistry of the recipe's formula. So those are really easy things to play around with in your baking. If you want to try different flavors or get a little bit creative, those are things you can change quantities of or change out what type you're using really easily. And that's a great way to kind of play around with baking. Spices do lose their potency over time. Some say that you should replace your spices like every 3 months. I don't think that's very practical for most people. Because it will, lose its potency. I also want to address cocoa powder. We kind of mentioned it earlier. Is sold in two main forms for baking. There is natural cocoa powder and there is Dutch processed cocoa powder, or you might see it labeled as alkalized cocoa powder. So both types of cocoa powder are obviously adding chocolate flavor to our baked goods, but they do differ in function. So natural cocoa powder is naturally acidic in nature. And so a lot of times natural cocoa powder is used in a recipe that has baking soda as the acidic ingredient to activate baking soda. So if you notice that a recipe calls specifically, oh no, I'm starting to freeze again. Okay. Hold on just a second. I'm just going to give it a second to see if it picks back up before I keep talking. Chris? Yeah? Can you come here a second? I don't know if it's because now you're on the computer or what. Is it getting any better? Let me know if it's starting to get better. It's just like as soon as you go on the computer, start freezing. Is there any idea? Is there able to run that cable directly to me? Probably not. It's going to be too hard. Okay, seems better now. Okay, hopefully we'll stay good. All right, well, please let me know. I'm trying to keep an eye on your comments. So if I start freezing again, let me know and I'll watch for it. So let's start with cocoa powder really quick again. So cocoa powder is sold in two main forms. It's sold as natural cocoa powder and Dutch processed cocoa powder. So natural cocoa powder is naturally acidic in nature, and it's often used in baking as the acidic ingredient needed for baking soda to interact with. So if you notice your recipe specifically calls for natural cocoa powder, it probably is a reason for that, because it's needing its acidity in the recipe. Dutch processed cocoa powder has gone through a chemical process to neutralize the cocoa's natural acidity. So if you find cocoa powder that says Dutch processed, or on the label it might say like processed with alkali, that is an indicator that it is not acidic in nature. And so it really should not be used in place of natural cocoa powder in your recipe, because it's not going to be able to activate the baking soda in your recipe. So if a recipe has been written properly, it really should specify which type of cocoa powder to use, or if either can be used. But if your recipe doesn't clarify, you can check the ingredient list. If it has baking soda in it, you might assume that you probably should use natural cocoa powder. If baking soda is not one of the ingredients in the recipe, you can use either. So hope that helps explain cocoa powder. That's something that a lot of people don't realize is important to note about cocoa powder, and it mess up your activate baking soda. Okay, any other ingredient questions before we move on to a quick section about making substitutions in baking? Okay, seems like people are able to see everything frying now. I am so sorry about the freezing. I do live streams all the time and I don't usually have this issue. I'm not sure what's going on. But please let me know if it happens again. Breaking up again. Oh, no. I don't know why it's happening today. I typically do not have this issue. All right, so let's talk quickly about some ingredient substitutions. So one of the most frequently asked questions I get is how to substitute different ingredients. And as a general rule of thumb, I always try to tell people that you're going to have the most success with your baking if you find recipes that call for the ingredients that you need to use, because that means they've been tested with the ingredients that you need to use. And making substitutions can take a lot of practice. You really need to be conscious of what the ingredient's function is, and making sure that you're substituting that with an ingredient that can function similarly. So I always say exercise caution when doing this, but I do understand that you're not always able to find recipes that are going to use the ingredients that you need to use. So a few general rules of thumb. Mine is small, I can't see too well. You can look at the document that is in the comments. That should help you follow along. I'm going in the order that's in that document that's pinned in the comments. Right now, we're in the ingredient substitution section. So let's talk about some general rules of thumb. Probably the most common question I get is, how do you make a recipe gluten-free? So the easiest way is to use a gluten-free all-purpose blend, something like Bob Red Mill or Cup for Cup. Those blends have been to be able to substitute that with something that can sort of mimic the way gluten functions. So using an all-purpose blend can really be the best way to do that. This is going to work best for things like quick breads, like muffins, batter breads, pancakes, waffles. It can work well for cookies and bars. It can work well for like sturdy cakes, like a butter cake or a carrot cake. Ugh, I'm freezing again. I don't know what's going on. I'm gonna give it a second I'm sorry, everyone. Don't usually have this problem. Not sure what's going on.
I'm not doing anything.
I know, but is that cord like too tied down?
Yeah, correct. And it wouldn't work if you changed it in the middle of the stream anyways.
All right. Okay, people, it seems like it's come back now. I'm not close to the storm. I'm in Chicago, so it shouldn't be the storm. I'm not sure. I don't typically have this many people watching my live stream at once. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with it. Hopefully the recording will still be good. It looks like it's been going the whole time. It doesn't look like it's been cutting out. So hopefully the recording should be okay. Okay. So the one type of baked good that you really don't want to try to use a gluten-free all-purpose blend for is yeast spreads, because yeast spreads, the gluten is such a big part of how it functions that substitution doesn't work well. You really want to be yeast spread gluten-free flour, because they're that way, and you're going well, and that's because we talked about there's so many different roles that eggs play in baking, that you need to be thinking about how. Okay. I'm just going to stop really quick. Lots of people are asking similar questions. There is a document at the very top of the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, it's pinned. If you're watching on Facebook, it's the top comment. You can click on it. It's a document for you to follow along with. And it's all of the information we're covering today. You need to make a copy of it if you want to add notes to it. Yeah. And then this will be posted on Facebook and YouTube once it's over. I'm recording this whole thing. I don't think the recording is freezing. So if there are parts that you've missed, you should be able to go back and watch it. So hopefully that will help. Okay, so whenever you want to substitute an egg, you really want to think about the function that the egg is serving. So is it just binding? So if you're making something like a brownie or a cookie or a quick bread, typically the egg isn't doing much more than like binding things together. And so therefore you can really easily use an egg substitute, something like a commercial egg substitute. There's one called Energy egg substitute, or you can use something like a chia egg or a flax egg. Or a lot of people like to use banana or applesauce. Of course, those are going to add flavor to your baked good. But you really also need to think about if the thing that your egg is doing is whipping a bunch of air into your baked good, that's not going to work as well for some of these egg substitutes. There is a lot people use chickpea. So they just drain off the liquid from like a can of chickpea, and that can be whipped up like egg whites, and it can be flavored with sugar and vanilla and make something similar to egg whites if you do need an egg-free egg white. But for things that are really like egg focused, I would suggest trying to find a recipe that has been, developed to be made like that. For dairy-free, that is pretty easy. If you want to make something dairy-free, you can substitute most milk products with a dairy-free version with very little issue. You can also use vegan butter or shortening in place of butter with a very little issue. It works well for most things like quick breads, muffins, cookies, bars, cakes, pastries. Those are all going to work pretty easily with dairy-free substitutions. The one thing that you're going to really want to find a specific dairy-free recipe for is if it's a really dairy-focused dessert. So something like a cheesecake or a flan. You don't really want to try to make those dairy-free on your own. I would look for a recipe that's already been made that way. Okay. I also want to talk about ingredient temperatures really quickly because there's some general rules of thumb to keep in mind. So typically your recipe is going to state whether things need to be cold or things need to be room temperature. And I'm referring to things that are typically kept in the refrigerator, like butter, eggs, milk. A lot of recipes will call for those to be at room temperature, but then some recipes will call for them to be cold. And there's always a reason for this. Recipe writers aren't just trying to, make you wait for your eggs to come to room temperature for no reason, but there are certain circumstances where it's more important than other circumstances. So as a general rule of thumb, when ingredients should be cold is when you are making anything with a really flaky final texture. Think about pie crust, biscuits, scones, something like a puff pastry. All of those things, you really want cold ingredients because you want the fat to stay solid until it hits the oven. Once it hits the oven, you want the fat to be solid because the crust is going to quickly solidify. Then the fat is going to melt and create steam, which creates little pockets in your baked goods. And that is going to get trapped in and create all of the flakiness. If, for instance, we tried to make biscuits and our butter was room temperature, that butter is going to make this more like homogeneous dough rather than having little pieces of fat throughout. And it's not going to give us that effect of all of those solid pieces of butter melting and creating all of that flakiness. So in general, flaky final texture, cold ingredients. For most everything else, we want room temperature ingredients. So eggs are going to more easily and readily incorporate into a batter if they are at room temperature. But you really, really need to be cautious of this whenever your recipe is calling for you to cream butter and sugar together. Butter is already an emulsion, meaning that it is a mixture of fat and water, which don't like to mix, but in butter, they are mixed into a homogeneous mixture. And so when you start adding other ingredients into butter, and if they are at a colder temperature than that butter, it is going to break that emulsion. And you are going to get this mixture that's kind of curdled looking and kind of separated looking. And you can still make cookies or cake with a broken mixture, but it's not going to have the texture that you're really looking for. It's going to be more dense. It's going to be drier. So anytime you're creaming butter and sugar together, that's when you really need to be cautious of your eggs being room temperature, your milk, any other ingredients that are cold, you need to bring them to room temperature. So here is a good example of what it looks like over the left is broken. So you can see it looks really curdled and there's kind of some liquid seeping out of it. And that's not what we want. That's not going to make a very nice texture with our baked goods. Appreciate it. You're getting a little sneak look that's kind of lots of baking science and baking techniques in my book. Cool. All right, I'm not seeing many questions right now. Let's talk about a few techniques that are really key. Recipe instructs you to cream something together. It's referring to when solid fat is beaten with sugar. Typically it's butter, but it can be shortening or lard. And when you beat those two together, a web of air is going to be trapped between the two ingredients, and then that air is going to help lighten and leaven the baked good. Whenever you're creaming something, if you're using a stand mixer, you always want to use the paddle attachment. You don't want to use the whisk attachment because it is going to, it doesn't necessarily, but it can break that emulsion of your butter like we talked about before. Typically, this is used for making cookies, buttercreams, butter-based cakes. And whenever you are creaming anything, your butter needs to be at a cool room temperature, somewhere around 68 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 to 22 degrees Celsius. And that is the temperature at which it can properly cream with the sugar. If you are too warm with that butter, it's not going to be able to properly cream. So the butter should not look really greasy. It should look like just really soft, but still like not have that filmy, greasy look to it. So the name of my book is Baker Betty's Better Baking Book. I'll put a link in the chat here in a minute, but if you are in Canada, you can order it from Amazon Canada. You have to go to Amazon Canada and you can look for Baker Betty and you'll be able to find it. What's the difference between start with sugar and butter versus and eggs? There aren't a lot of recipes that have butter the sugar into rather than the sugar and butter. That's the biggest difference. Okay, so let's talk about the technique of cutting in. So whenever a recipe calls for you to cut in something, it's referring to when solid pieces of fat are worked into flour. So you are cutting in flour, you're cutting in butter or shortening or lard into a dry mixture. And you can do this with a tool called a pastry blender. It's kind of this metal tool that has like really sturdy kind of like knives on the bottom, and you will use that to mix the fat throughout. You can also do it with the tips of your fingers. You kind of work your fingertips and work the fat throughout the flour. Or some people really like to use a food processor, or some people like to freeze their butter and grate it on a cheese grater. I don't really like the cheese grater technique, and that's because it is going to not get mixed in the flour in a way in which the flour is being coated in fat. When you cut something in, you are coating the flour in fat, and it is not only distributing all of those solid pieces of fat throughout, but it's creating that barrier between the liquid and the flour so that it reduces gluten formation. So if you grate your butter on a cheese grater and then add it in, you're not getting that benefit of the flour getting coated in fat. That's a personal preference. A lot of people do like that method. You can kind of try what works best for you. It's essential that the fat is cold whenever a recipe calls for cutting in, and that's because we want it to stay solid. We want little pockets of flakiness to happen once it's baked. I'm going to show you this little video clip here. This is on my YouTube channel. This is a video that's called Pie Crust Masterclass or something like that. But I am working the butter and shortening through my flour here. I'm using my fingertips rather than a pastry blender. And what I like to do is really press down on the pieces of fat so they're kind of like flattened out into little sheets. And then I work that through. Some of them will become much smaller. Some of them will stay a little bit bigger. And it just gives that really nice flaky texture. So if you don't have a pastry blender, fingertips are fine, but you want to work quickly because you don't want to fat too much. If it starts feeling like the butter is getting a little bit too warm, you can throw your bowl into the refrigerator or freezer to let it firm back up and then continue working it through. Quickly, talk technique of folding. We're getting to appreciate you all hanging. I really hope this has been informative. I know we're covering a lot of topics. So folding is a technique that's used to incorporate two mixtures together in a very delicate way. And this is because we're trying to reduce gluten development, but we're also usually trying to preserve air that is in the egg whites or the whipped cream. So the technique is kind of difficult to explain. I have a video here to show you because I think that's the easiest way to show it. But whenever you are folding something like a meringue or a whipped cream in, I'll show you here in this video as I describe it. You want to start by adding a little bit of the meringue or the whipped cream in and stirring that in completely. Don't worry about the air coming out of it at this point. I would say that I added maybe like a quarter of my total meringue in this video. And what I'm doing is stirring that in completely to kind of lighten the batter to a texture that I'm going to more easily be able to incorporate the rest of the meringue in. So now here I'm folding in. So the movement is I'm using my spatula, I'm cutting down through the middle of the batter, and I'm pulling what's from the bottom on the bowl up to the top of the bowl and folding my spatula over. And I kind of scrape around the outside of the bowl as I do this. And I am, it looks like I'm doing this kind of quickly in this video because it's a little bit sped up, but you want to take your time, you want to go slowly. You're just trying to do this in as gentle of a way as possible to preserve as much air as you can in your egg whites or whatever it is you're folding in, because that's going to really give you the nicest texture of your cake or whatever it is you're making. I want to quickly show you how to knead dough by hand. You can always knead dough in a mixer with a dough hook, but I really like people to know how to knead dough by hand because you really don't need any specialty equipment to make bread. You can make it all with your hands with a very few pieces of equipment. So kneading is the process of working our dough in a way that is going to stretch it out and build strength and elasticity in the dough through the process of gluten development. So we use this whenever we're making yeast bread, and that's because yeast is going to produce gases really slowly, and we need the dough to be strong enough to hold those gases in our dough. If we don't build the gluten structure in our dough, the gases are going to kind of like escape out of the dough as it's rising. So that is the main function of kneading. I have a little video here to show you how I knead by hand. There's no one method, but start with a pretty well floured surface. You can see my dough here is pretty sticky. I try to hold back a decent amount of flour when I first mix my dough because you can always knead more in and it's going to get less sticky as you knead it. So I fold the dough towards myself and then I use the heel of my hand to push it away. And you're really focusing on the pressure going across the dough rather than down into the table. If you are focusing your pressure down into the table, it's going to stick so bad to your table. This is the same thing you want to think about too if you're rolling out anything. If you're rolling out dough like a pie crust or something like that, you really want to focus your pressure on going across rather than down in, because that is it's going to stick all over the place. So that takes a little bit of practice to kind of get the feel of how to knead, but I think it's kind of therapeutic. I really like kneading by hand, and it might be something you want to try. I really want to do just a really quick few troubleshooting scenarios. I think I have like 3 troubleshooting scenarios, and then that is it. I'll answer any more last minute questions and give you links to resources. So let's talk about troubleshooting cookie spreading. This is one of the most common problems I hear from people. And whenever cookies spread out too much like this, the most common problem is not enough heat in the oven. So the reason that makes things spread is because if the oven is not hot enough, the butter or whatever fat you're using in your cookie is going to slowly melt and spread the dough out before the crust of the cookie has time to set. So we want to make sure our oven is for sure up to temperature, because then it's going to more quickly set the crust and then the butter will melt and it's not going to spread as far out. It can also be that maybe there's too much butter in your dough. That can be a problem. It's not as common of an instance. Or it can be that you have over creamed your butter. So if you cream your butter way too much, you're going to put way too much air into it, and then it's going to spread out really, really far. She's saying she has the opposite issue, always cakey. So typically if your cookies are too cakey, a lot of times that can be an over measuring your flour issue. If you don't already measure by weight, if you know me, you know I'm a huge fan of measuring by weight. It just prevents so many issues. But If you're measuring by volume, you want to make sure that when you measure by volume, instead of scooping your measuring cup down into your flour, you want to take a spoon and kind of stir your flour up and then lightly spoon it into your measuring cup. Do not pack it down at all, and then level it off. And one of the most common issues I see with all baking is there just being too much flour in your baked goods. So a cakey cookie is likely the result of too much flour in your baked good. If you are weighing your ingredients and it's still too cakey, it can be an over mixing issue. It could be that if you're at high altitude, that might be an issue, or maybe it's just the recipe you're using. Recipe might be a cakey cookie recipe, and maybe you want to look for one that's specifically a chewy cookie recipe. So yeah, back to the oven temperature. If you don't already have an oven thermometer, highly suggest investing in one. You can get one for less than $5. And what I do is I put it in the oven, preheat to 350 or 175 Celsius for about 20 minutes, and then check the thermometer and see if it's actually at temperature. A lot of times it's not actually heating to the temperature you set it at. So then you can either get your oven calibrated, or you can, adjust based on that. Like if it's not getting hot enough, you'll set the temperature a little higher, or vice versa. A couple other cookie issues can be if they're too dry or crumbly. It can be, like I said, over measuring flour or over mixing. Or if like your cookies are lopsided, sometimes you'll see like there'll be like one little spot on your cookie that's kind of like really bubbly and lopsided. That's usually because your leavening didn't get mixed in properly, and there's like, it's not evenly distributed. So make sure you like really scrape the bottom of your bowl and like get all the way down under your batter. Let's quickly talk about some cake troubleshooting. So if your cake is collapsed in the middle, it can be underbaked, but it can also be that too much steam escaped during the baking process. You really want to be careful not to open your oven until the very end of your baking process. And that's for all baking, because it lets out such a great deal of heat and steam, and it can really affect your baked goods. Try to use the light in your oven and just peek through the window until the very end. A cake can also collapse if it's a really delicate cake. If you like jump or walk really heavily near your oven, it can like actually make it fall while it's rising. If your cake is too dense or it didn't rise, that can be a result of your creamed mixture not being properly incorporated. So you broke that cream mixture. That can make it really dense. It could be that your leavening is old. Baking soda and baking powder do not have indefinite shelf life. So if your leavening is old, it can make your cake not rise. Or again, it could be an oven temperature thing. If your oven is not hot enough, that can be too dense of a cake. If it's cracked on top, a lot of times that's, again, an over measuring of flour issue, or that can be that your oven is too hot, because your cake is going to rise really rapidly because it's so hot, and then that can make it crack. And then I think this is my last one, my bread troubleshooting. So if you have tunneling issues in your bread, if you cut into like a loaf of bread and you have a tunnel through it, that can be improper shaping technique. When you go to shape your bread, you're going to want to make sure that you really degas it. You don't have big bubbles in it before you shape it. And as you're shaping it, you want to make sure you're not getting a lot of gas trapped in it. If you're getting any big air bubbles, you want to kind of press them out, because that can cause tunneling. It can also be from not building a strong enough gluten structure. Underproofing or overproofing your dough can cause a bread that's too dense. So if you didn't proof it long enough, or if you went too far with it, that can make your bread too dense. I'm going to show you an example in this video here of how to check the proof on your dough. It can also be too much flour. So whenever you're working with a dough, for most standard bread recipes, you want the dough to feel really tacky and sticky. You don't want it to feel like dry. And it's very common to work too much flour into your dough. If your crust splits on the side, like especially if it's a sandwich loaf, you get that kind of like split on the side. That is typically an underproofing issue. You put it in the oven a little bit too early, and you just need to let it rise a little bit longer. And it can also just be an improper shaping technique. So let me quickly show you this example. I'm showing you how to check your proof here on this dough. I have 2 sandwich loaves here. The one on the left is underproofed. The one on the right is on the verge of being overproofed. So what I do is I take a floured finger, I press into the dough about a 1/2 inch down, and you're checking to see how quickly that hole fills in. If it pops up really quickly, that's a sign that it needs more time to proof. If it fills in with about maybe 2 or 3 seconds time, that's a really good sign that you are ready to go in the oven. Now, if it feels like it's going to collapse when you do this little poke test, or it does collapse, if it just feels really weak, that is a sign you've gone too far with the proofing. It's losing its strength and structure, and it's likely going to collapse in the oven. I still would go ahead and bake it. You can always use it to make croutons or breadcrumbs or something like that, but you can't really come back from overproofing. So you want to see your this low, and that indication is like not at all. This dough is approved, and it's really pie shooting. So for pie crust, with pie crusting, and this can be the you put it in. You never want to stretch it to fit. You want it to really lay naturally down in your pie plate. You can just kind of like pull it up on the sides and let it naturally fall in. You never want to stretch it to make it fit. It's going to shrink on you. It can also be that your oven is not hot enough. If it's not hot enough, it won't set the crust fast enough. Also, if you make pie crust with only butter in it, it's going to shrink. There's no getting around it. You can do a lot of things to help minimize the shrinkage, but you are going to have shrinkage with all butter. It's just inevitable. So I like to use a little bit of shortening in my pie crust. That really helps prevent shrinkage. I use like mostly butter with just a little bit of shortening. If your crust is too tough, that's typically an issue with over mixing or over handling your pie crust. You want to mix as little as possible. If you have a soggy bottom, that is typically an underbaked crust, or your oven was not hot enough, or you didn't cut your fat into the dough enough. So those can be your main issues for a soggy bottom. Yes, if you're watching on TikTok, I'm not able to show you my screen, but these videos will be posted on my YouTube and Facebook page for you to go back and watch, and you can see the presentation that I have on my screen. So that is all I have for you today. I did want to share with you that I did just write this book. It's called Baker Betty's Better Baking Book. It is a baking fundamentals book. A lot of what I covered today is a sneak peek of what is in the book. I'm going to put some links here in our chat if you want to look for that. It comes out in November. And please let me know if you have any other questions. I'll stay on here for a little bit and answer more questions. Oh, I closed out of my screen. Oh no, am I still here? Okay, sorry. I thought I closed out on you. Okay, good. I didn't. If a recipe doesn't indicate a type of salt, is table salt assumed? I think it kind of depends on who the recipe writer is. If it's a professional chef or like a professional recipe writer, well, one, they should tell you. But typically they're using sea salt or kosher salt. So I typically, professionals are not using table salt for baking. But if it's like a home cooked recipe, you might assume table salt for sure. I'm going to put the link for the document in the chat too, if you want to go, if you don't see that right now. This document is pretty much everything we covered today. You can make a copy of it, make your own notes. There's links there if you want to find me on Instagram, TikTok, all the places. There's links there for my book if you're interested in getting it. You can just look for Baker Betty pretty much wherever books are sold: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, Bookshop, IndieBound, all those places. Let me see if I missed any questions. Thank you all so much. If you want a book with my signature, we are ordering book plates, and I think we're going to get about 500 of them, and I am going to sign them all, and then you can send me a proof of pre-order, and I will send you a book plate. I'm going to be announcing that on social media as soon as we get it sorted out, so look for it on TikTok and look for it on Instagram. I'll be announcing that. Himalayan salt, I mean, it's really not any different. I know a lot of people really like it. It's pretty. I don't find there's no real difference in it. You can use it in place of sea salt or kosher salt. Let me see if I missed any other questions here. Do I prefer glass or metal pie tin? I really like glass because I am able to look under and make sure the crust is set. And I prefer that. Metal is going to conduct heat a little bit better and your crust will set a little faster. It's just kind of a personal preference. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you enjoyed today. Just making sure I'm not missing any questions. Oh, thank you so much for pre-ordering the book. I really, really hope you love it. And this, absolutely, if you make brown butter, you want to make sure you get every little bit of those milk solids in your baked good. That is where most of the flavor lies. What else? Make sure I'm not missing any. What about Crisco and pie crust? Crisco and pie crust makes a super, super tender pie crust. Crisco is shortening. You might not have been on earlier, but I talked about shortening earlier. It has a higher melting point, so it can really prevent shrinking of your pie crust, but it's going to leave kind of like a to be honest, you're really good with cooking, but not good at baking because it's more of a science. So yeah, that's actually really the goal of my book is I'm really trying to break down all of the basics of baking science so that it's super approachable. All of the recipes in my book are customizable master recipes. So I give you this recipe and then I show you how you can customize it to make it exactly how you want it with whatever flavor you want it, how you can, combine things together to make all kinds of different things. What was the name of that lard you mentioned earlier? So leaf lard is the type of lard that is really white in color and mild in flavor. It's taken from like a specific part of the pig that's like this very pure form of fat. There's no like meat tissue in it. So it just makes a really mild in flavor fat. Leaf lard is what it's called. I'm so glad. I'm really happy you all were able to join me today. I am at Baker Betty on all of the social media platforms. If you want to find me on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, I am bakerbetty@gmail.com. Betty with an IE, not a Y. And then my book that's coming out in November is Baker Betty's Better Baking Book. And a lot of what we covered today is a really good sneak peek into what is covered in that book. So I really hope you found it useful. And I'm not seeing any more questions rolling in. So if nobody else has any other questions, we will sign off here. You can find this video on my YouTube page and on my Facebook Baker Betty page. If you want to go back and watch, I know I was freezing up in a lot of parts, so hopefully you'll be able to go back and watch those parts. What are my other books, articles, blogs be helpful to learn from? I really love Sally's Baking Addiction. She does a really good job at testing her recipes. She actually wrote the foreword of my book, not to keep promoting my book, but she does a great job of explaining things and testing her recipes. My website has tons of free tutorials on it. I like to break down techniques. My website is bakerbetty.com. I really like, if you're interested in bread baking, I love the book. It's called Bread Baking for Beginners. It does traditional yeasted bread baking and sourdough bread baking. It's a really great book to get your feet wet. What else? Cook's Illustrated Cookbook is amazing. It's been one of my best references for years. You can purchase my book really anywhere books are sold. You can ask your local bookstore to order it for you, or you can find it on Amazon. Here, I'll put the links one more time in the chat. You can find it on Amazon, Bookshop, Barnes & Noble, Chapters, Indigo, IndieBound. You're just going to look for Baker Betty and it will come up. But here, I'll put the links here for you again. Thank you so much for joining. I so appreciate you joining. Awesome. I use that lard is good, not as the one in Little Italy. Yeah. Awesome. Am I going to do a sourdough workshop? I do have a sourdough workshop coming up, a virtual one. I'm not doing einkorn in that one because it's just a beginner sourdough workshop. But if you go to my website, bakerbetty.com, or if you go to Eventbrite, you can find tickets for it. It's going to be a full day event. We're going to take lots of breaks throughout the day, but sourdough is a long process and I want to take you through the whole process. So we're going to start at like 10 o'clock in the morning and then we're going to go till 6 o'clock in the evening, but there will be like little chunks of sessions, like an hour, 2 hour throughout the day to go through the whole process of making bread. So if you go to Eventbrite and look for Baker Betty Sourdough, you'll find it. It's a virtual workshop you'll be able to watch from home. Link to Amazon not working. Let me try and give it one more time. This is the Amazon link. Let me know if that worked for you. How to use applesauce in place of oil. That can work well in quick breads, things like a banana bread or a like zucchini bread or muffins and things like that. You don't really want to do it in most baked goods, but you would do it by volume, just the same amount by volume. Or you would maybe want to specifically look for a recipe that's made with applesauce. I don't have a recipe for crumpets currently. I've actually. Okay, perfect. I'm so glad it worked for you. Okay. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm going to end the broadcast. It'll probably take a bit to process, but then the video will be live. The sourdough workshop is in October. I can't think of the exact date right now, but it's a Sunday in October. Let me see if I can find the link and I'll give it to you here. I'm getting the link for the sourdough workshop really quick for you. The sourdough workshop is October 17th and it is a Sunday. Here is the link for that if you are interested in checking that out. It is a virtual workshop, so you can watch from wherever you are. And for those of you on TikTok, if you're interested in it, I'll put a link in my bio. In fact, there might already be a link in my bio for it. I will not be doing a specific einkorn workshop anytime soon. I may do just a general whole grain sourdough workshop sometime in the future in which einkorn would be incorporated. I really enjoy doing kind of like the beginner intro stuff with sourdough though. So right now I'm not doing that. It's a little more advanced. If you're interested in things like that, you might check out Elaine Foodbod on Instagram. She does tons of whole grain sourdough baking, and she also has a book that does a lot of whole grain, and I think she uses einkorn in that book. All right. Any good resources for cake decorating? If you're looking for some basic cake decorating classes, I have some on my online baking school. It's called betterbakingschool.com. There's a couple of basic cake decorating classes there. You might also check out Sugar Geek Show. She is a cake decorator. She's one of my friends. I'm going to put her website here in the comments. And that's a great one to look for. I'm not sure why Amazon has an error for you, Susan. Are you in the US? I put Sugar Geek Show in the comments, and she has tons of cake tutorials. I'm so glad that you just go to Amazon and type for you. Not sure why the link's not working for you. If you are not in the US, that is a US link for Amazon. If you're in Canada, you're going to have to go directly to Amazon and do it, or I can find the one specifically for Canada for you, or I'm not sure where you're at. I know you can order it in the UK, Canada, Australia, Germany, France, those places. I found the jars for my vanilla extract at a thrift store, but I know that you can get them at IKEA or the Container Store. All right. Elaine Foodbod is the sourdough baker I was recommending. Let me find her and I'll give you a link. Let me take this off. Let me find Elaine for you. She does tons of whole grain sourdough baking, so I'm sure she does a lot of einkorn stuff. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and end this live stream. Thank you so much for joining, and I hope you join me again in the future. I'll try to do some more live streams in the future. Happy baking, everyone. Bye.